Welcome to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, one of the world's rapidly growing economies. This and other emerging economies are expected to enjoy strong and continuing growth, helping to expand the global economy. A rise in the world's population of another 1.2 billion people by 2030 will place unprecedented demands on the world's resources. An increasingly prosperous and rapidly urbanizing population will need more food, more energy, more water, and more raw materials of all kinds. This spiraling demand will also add to the challenge of global warming. So, is such a massive growth spurt sustainable? That's the question for this week's BBC World Debate from Dubai. Natural resources, are there enough to go round? By 2030, there will be 8 billion people on the planet. This growing population is expected to be accompanied by increasing wealth for many in the developing world. Their economies are expanding at an average of 6% each year. By 2030, the world economy could well be demanding 40% more energy. Farmers may need to increase production by between 70 and 100%, with an expected 50% increase in demand for meat. It's predicted there will be a 40% shortfall between freshwater demand and supply. Vital raw materials like copper are now already in such demand that prices are at historic highs. So, might spiraling demand leading to scarce supply and rocketing prices choke off burgeoning global economic growth? Will it mean crisis and conflict both within and between nations? Welcome to the World Economic Forum and the Government of Dubai's Summit on the Global Agenda. Joining us for this BBC World Debate, Louise Arbour, who is President of the International Crisis Group, a non-governmental organisation working on the prevention of conflicts all around the world. She was previously UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and before that Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. Malini Mehra is founder and chief executive of the Centre for Social Markets, a non-profit organisation working in India to encourage sustainable development. She also serves on the Corporate Responsibility Forum, the advisory board of BHP Billiton, the world's largest mining company based in Australia, as well as Unilever and Kimberly-Clark. Kevin Rudd, Foreign Minister of Australia. Until June, you were Prime Minister, and one reason you lost political support was because of the backlash from mining companies over the government decision to impose a so-called super tax on their super profits. He Yafei is China's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva and a former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, a key member of China's climate change negotiating team in Copenhagen. And James Cameron, both an environmental lawyer and founder of Climate Change Capital, which invests in companies to combat global warming, also on the British Prime Minister's Business Advisory Group. Welcome to you all here in Dubai. Well, let's get right into that question. Natural resources, are there enough to go around? Malini Mehra.
Well, clearly, we're heading towards a crisis, particularly if we're talking about access to energy security for large parts of the developing world and water security for much of the world and food security. So 3 key areas of flashpoints.
You do use that word crisis, do you?
I think there's no mistake about it. These are being used by heads of states themselves.
Louise Arbour, are there enough resources to go around, natural resources to go around or not?
Well, I think the question is how they can be managed. If we're talking about competition, an increased demand, a diminishing supply, inevitably we're talking about competition. And it seems to me we clearly need sort of dispute resolution mechanisms, equitable distribution of these scarce resources. So there's always enough to go around. That's not the point if it's equitably distributed and if conflicts can be resolved peacefully.
Would you use the word crisis or not?
Well, I think there's a difference between crisis in the supply and crisis in the management or the mismanagement of what's available to us collectively.
Ambassador He Yafei, the view from China, natural resources, are there really enough to go around? You in China give the impression of wanting to grab whatever you can while you can.
Probably that is not true. Urbanization industrialization, globalization have brought us huge benefits. You mentioned increased wealth for many countries, but we pay the price too. The price being environmental degradation, ecosystem imbalance, and also possible depletion of natural resources.
But are there enough to go round? That's the question at the moment.
Probably that's for scientists to determine, but I would say that we have reached a crisis level, a critical moment where we need to very carefully manage what we have.
Kevin Rudd, Foreign Minister of Australia, you're benefiting enormously from natural resources, including in your own state, Queensland. Is there enough to go round?
I don't see it as a crisis, I see it as a challenge, which if we're intelligent about it, we can manage. And the reason I say that is while the numbers look scary, which is to deal with that population increase you referred to before, you're looking at a 70% necessary increase in food production. You're looking at, over the next 15 years, a 36% increase in primary energy generation. We're still looking at profound water shortages. Leave water to one side for the moment, it's slightly different. But on the first two, if we manage it effectively, and that means having properly functioning markets, determining a properly functioning market price, and simultaneously identify and agree where the market failures are, to wit, a price on carbon, we can get it right.
But you're saying it's a challenge. You wouldn't use the word crisis.
It's a challenge. A crisis suggests that it's almost beyond our reach. Challenge means that if you look at the history of humankind, we've been in periods of food scarcity on and off throughout history. In terms of energy demand, we have a particular challenge in terms of a price on carbon. We can get there. It requires, however, political will to get the decisions right nationally and globally.
Let's come on to that in a moment. James Cameron, natural resources, are there enough to go around in your view?
Well, I'm happy to go with stressing of management, the highlighting of the challenge, the sense of optimism that these challenges can be met. But I would emphasize the crisis that is present in those resources that we depend upon for our existence. So we have hard physical limits imposed by the natural environment. The atmosphere is a scarce resource. And we have to treat that as if it is entirely limited. Whereas many of the other resources, through a certain type of management, we can expand, we can manage in a way that can distribute more effectively. But with some of these physical resources upon which we depend, we have to assume there are absolute limits, and we have to recognize that we are at a point where unless we behave differently, unless we invest differently, then that crisis will be punishing to humankind.
Malini, Mehra, in terms of scale, you heard the Foreign Minister say this is a challenge. You've heard Louise Arbour. You're using the word crisis along with the Ambassador here. What would you say to the fact it's only a challenge, not a crisis?
Well, I'm using the term crisis advisedly because I think if one speaks about it in moderate terms, then the necessary level of urgency is not conveyed. If you're looking just at biophysical limits, which James mentioned, you look at the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. We're already reaching unsustainable levels of ocean acidification. Look at the capacity of forests to absorb carbon dioxide, similarly compromised. So we are compromising the very essence of the planet's ability to provide ecosystem services, and I think that constitutes a planetary crisis.
Planetary crisis, do we have agreement here, Ambassador?
Now, if I may, in terms of food and water, I think we are reaching that level, the crisis, you can call it a crisis, because population will grow from 6 billion to 9 billion by 2050, and we need at least to increase food production by 70%. And that is a crisis point, and we're reaching that. Also, the crisis we have, or challenges we have, are global in nature. It's all interconnected. The consequences are very much serious, especially serious for LDC countries.
Let's hear from 2 or 3 other people. First of all, let's go to a view from Ghana, from Joyce Ariye. You're Chief Executive of the Ghana Chamber of Mines. Do you see, where you're sitting in West Africa, an enormous crisis on natural resources or not?
I don't see it as a crisis. I think we need to learn to manage and synergize exploration, exploitation, the use and value addition.
Where you come from, do you
Yes.
think people appreciate how difficult and challenging this really is now?
Yes, but they also believe that it can be managed.
Let's go to Andrew Wales, you're Head of Sustainable Development for the enormous multinational SAB Miller. You are accused of using too much water. How are you addressing this? Do you see a real pressure on natural resources at the moment or not?
I think you're right that we face a very significant natural resource challenge, but I would see it as a shared risk. It's a risk which companies are beginning to take very seriously. Obviously, governments and NGOs are as well. And I think, it's also interconnected. If you look at the fact that water scarcity threatens energy security, threatens food supply, threatens, as well as, of course, human health. So actually, it's an interconnected challenge, so we can only solve it by working together. So we will lose if we compete for resources.
Can you convince us here that industry really understands how acute this potentially is, or not?
Yes. I think we've only just begun to scratch the surface of environmental efficiency that can be achieved through industry and working in our supply chains. So my business has a target to cut water use by 25% by 2015 and carbon 50% by 2020, and we're making progress towards that. And many large multinationals are doing the same, but it's going to take some time for that to work through the system, and particularly through the supply chain.
All right, well, let's look at the implications here with the panel. Malini, Mehra.
Well, I think if you look just at one of those challenging areas, as Andy has said, these are interlocking multiple challenges or crises, whatever the nomenclature is, whether we're talking about energy or food or water security. And clearly, we have to differentiate between the availability or not of these scarce resources and the access to these resources. Because people in my country are going hungry. We have 45% of our children who are malnourished. Not because there isn't enough food in the country. We are, after all, the largest exporter of dairy products in the world, milk in the world. It's because of inequitable practices domestically. So unless we address the policy as well as the emphasis or lack of emphasis which is given to equitable distribution, we're not going to solve this challenge.
There's a lot of nodding of heads here around the panel, but you, Louise Arbour, your international crisis group, even though you say it's not maybe fully a crisis at the moment, what do you see, what do you predict are the economic, social and political impacts of this?
Well, I think this is the absolute critical issue. It's to look at the inequities, absolutely intolerable inequities within states and between states in access to the fundamentals of sustaining life. And I think we could see tremendous deficits and tolerance for inequities, both domestically and internationally. It's not clear that they're harder to solve internationally. Some of them are very difficult to solve within countries, and the legal political infrastructure is not always there. That's why, for instance, you have displacement of populations. We often think of massive movements of population, for instance, from the south to the north, but the most dramatic impact of scarcity of resources is very often felt by displacement within a country, which are very acute, very difficult to manage and put people at risk, and yet don't attract the same kind of attention, I think, as this fear of massive population movements. But all this, again, I think is manageable with political will and some imaginative solutions.
Do you think there is enough political will at the moment? We just heard that industry maybe is only just beginning to wake up to the enormity of this challenge.
Well, I think it's unevenly applied if there is political will. I think it becomes very acute when there is a particular point of crisis, and there have been very many. I think the food price riots, it didn't take very much to get people in the street. And then the danger there is not just this immediate response, it's the repression that it triggers. So then you are in a very difficult to break cycle of protest and repression, which transforms issues that would be manageable of access to resources into conflict, which becomes a lot more difficult.
James Cameron.
I really think that's a place where we do have to spend uncomfortable time contemplating a very unpleasant risk, which is that if there is a suspicion, a perception of resource scarcity, and in times that are quite difficult in any event, then there is a tendency to find simplistic solutions, nationalistic solutions. Pick me, I'm going to solve this problem, I'm going to take that resource for you. I'm going to look after your interests by triumphing, by taking somebody else's in order to look after my own. And that trend, I see signs of just beginning, that nationalist movements are attracted to resource scarcity arguments, which is one of the reasons why we have to be careful with the language. You know, if we talk up too much crisis and resource scarcity and play down the capacity to manage, we actually increase the risk that some nationalist leader seizes that opportunity in a chaotic situation to take control. And we have to believe in our capacity to manage this, to use market instruments, to find business solutions, because believe me, they're there. There's a lot going on in the business world on water disclosure and carbon disclosure, new metrics emerging. Not sufficient, but enough to be confident that there is a rational way of responding to this before you get to crisis and nationalism and conflict.
Kevin Rudd, that issue of political will, you've just been Prime Minister, you're now Foreign Minister. Do you see that as a really serious deficit, the inability of politicians to confront the enormity, certainly within the pressures of the electoral cycle?
I think in contemporary, I can only speak in contemporary Western politics, I think it's really tough. Reasonably defined electoral terms, transacting complex messages with a domestic population who don't get the complexity of what you're on about often. And part of that's our responsibility to put it into language which is easily understandable. But it's still doable and it's necessary to do.
Is the urgency on your agenda?
The urgency is shared by many international leaders who I know. The key question is making our institutions work. For example, we're about to meet again in Cancun. It's 12 months since Copenhagen. That'll deal with the unfinished business from then, and there's a lot of unfinished business from then. The G20 has a huge agenda now on development. That's critical for dealing with, frankly, another market failure, which Louise was just talking about before, the fact that 2 billion of the folk who will make up the 9 billion of the world's population come mid-century will be suffering hunger. And therefore, that market failure has to be dealt with as well. So I'd just say in summary, getting the markets right is terrific, it's important. Making sure you get a price on water and a price on carbon, because that actually dictates behaviour. Then, the other public good here is to make sure governments have a capacity to make sure that the trading system is working internally and externally around the world, so that those forces can have their play and create the incentives in Africa for people to engage in agriculture. If you've got $260 billion being spent by the OECD each year on food subsidies and other agricultural distortions, and $110 billion gets paid to the same developing countries in ODA, frankly, I would rather see them take some action on the agricultural distortions. That deals with the heart of the food sustainability, food scarcity problem.
Malini, Mehra, though, do you have confidence in the institutions to resolve and preempt the kind of crisis, in your words, not mine, that you foresee in the coming years?
I think clearly not. I think why we're seeing such a rise of critique against governments is because people are very unsatisfied at the quality of governance that we have presently. Let's just talk for a minute and let's just pause and recollect what actually happened at Copenhagen. We had 120 heads of states who attended that meeting, which was supposed to produce a legally binding document at the end of it. We've never had that degree of political focused will on any international process, and yet our politicians failed to deliver. Now, I think that looking at the glass is half full, clearly there are others. There is business, progressive business in the sidelines, a number of key countries, for example, those members of the Cartagena group, which are willing to provide the governance systems that can actually deliver.
But do you think those systems realize the enormity of the challenge in the way we're laying it out here?
I think at this stage in early 21st century that frankly we do have a governance gap. And it's the governance gap which is failing to address the market failures that the Minister has so eloquently spoken of. If there was a governance ability to actually deal with these gaps, we wouldn't be here discussing them now.
Ambassador He.
I think the political will is what we need.
Do you think it's there?
It's there, it's not quite there, because the governments, they do have political will domestically for one country. Yeah. But the political will to contribute in an integrated fashion to make the world safe from the crisis of water shortage, food shortage, it's not quite there. I mean, Kevin mentioned Western politics, political system, short-term electoral cycle, etc. It's hampering progress. Urgency, we all realize that there is urgency to address these issues. I believe national efforts will be coupled with regional and international
But let's be clear, in your new 5-year plan in China, do you recognize the acute stress which is emerging on so many of these natural resources or not?
This is one of the focal points of the 12th 5-year plan. The plan will not be ready until next year. People's Congress will pass it.
But it's sending a message to your people.
But the message is already there. Chinese economy cannot really be dependent so much on consumption of raw materials. because we import so much from Australia, for instance.
We'll come on to that in a moment. Louise Arbour, again, you have to look. You weekly produce a list of where the threats are, where the crises are, what's getting better, what's getting worse. What has to stop the red ink appearing more frequently based on natural resource problems in the coming months and years?
I think it's absolutely clear that scarcity of access to resources in and of itself is unlikely to be the sole trigger for conflict. It's usually mixed with the very traditional territorial protection of territorial integrity, claims of self-determination, conflicts based on legitimate grievances, conflict fueled by greed. All of these ingredients will come into the play. The one thing, though, that I think is a pretty common theme is lack of proper governance, certainly nationally, regionally, and inadequate global governance.
James Cameron, do you have any optimism that if it's seen as so acute, natural resources, that the systems of governance, political will be there?
And there's one big institution that we all talk about slightly easily, but is very complex, which we call the markets. The global commodity markets cannot today work off any sensible metrics, no price references for the vital underlying resources upon which those commodities depend. So we have nothing that values soil quality, carbon sequestration in soils. We have nothing that values hydrology. We have nothing that values the proxy of the maintenance of an ecosystem around which it is possible to grow food to meet this new demand that's created. So the people who are in those markets every day, very skilled people with a lot of money moving, they have a strong interest in fixing the mispricing. Otherwise, we're all heading towards something really very disastrous.
The core question, though, I believe, which lies at the heart of points made here and by you, is this. Are our friends in China, and I've known He Yafei for a long time, are they, in looking at their long-term resource strategy worldwide, Australia, Latin America and Africa, looking at it in terms of a self-sufficiency paradigm, or are they relying upon and wishing to build with us a global trading system which meets everyone's needs on the way through? Now that is a provocative question in our forum here, I understand that, but that I believe is the challenge of managing global resource constraints and scarcity in the future. If we've got a properly functioning trading system, it'll work. If we don't, it won't.
Do you feel that Australia is hostage to China's insatiable demand for resources, that you could be vulnerable? You yourself earlier this year warned that the region is stable at the moment, but it's not guaranteed for the future.
We don't feel faintly vulnerable because our diversity of external trade is large, our diversity of external investment coming to Australia is large as well. It's true we live, however, in a highly volatile region. If you look at East Asia and the West Pacific in the 21st century, the unresolved territorial disputes of our region, for example, remind us of earlier centuries in Europe. The challenge for us, and I think we're doing it okay so far, is to manage those disputes in a way which doesn't rise to crisis, North Korean behaviour to one side. That, I think, is the challenge which lies ahead of it, and I think our respective governments are doing okay on that front right now.
I agree with Kevin. The relationship between China and Australia in terms of interdependence is a win-win situation. Win-win situation for Australia. Australia is the only one country whose trade with China didn't drop after the financial crisis. Of the first 10 trading partners of China, our trade with them all dropped after the financial crisis. Australia is the only exception. Actually, in 2009, grew by 31%. China, of course, benefited a lot from a steady supply of raw material from Australia. Second point I want to make is not only Australia and China. I think this interdependence is everywhere, all over the world. It's a result of globalization. So it will be wrong to single out Australia and China as an example that we do something special, which is not true. You go to those places where they have resources, they can supply, and they can have steady supply. And you go to those places where you can sell your goods. That's why I'm trying to emphasize, it's not just Australia and China. It's globalization. We go to Africa, for instance, and our cooperation with Africa, I believe you're going to talk about it, is quite extensive. And people wrongly believe our cooperation with Africa is only in natural resources, which is not true.
Let's pick up on that. Louise, pick up in a moment on this, because it does prompt the question about Africa, fast becoming a major economic and growing market, an exporter of raw materials as well, with China buying itself into the position of preferred customer now in many African nations. Are these nations wise to mortgage their economic well-being to the needs of Beijing? Well, Kande Yumkela from Sierra Leone, Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. Do you think that Africa is wise at the moment to be doing what it's doing, developing this enormous axis which the ambassador has just talked about here?
Well, let's put it in context. Africa has been the quarry for various industrialization waves. We helped to finance the first industrial revolution with our natural resources. And so when we see a scramble now by many industrial countries, again, for Africa's natural resources, there's concern. One concern being, will this new natural capital we're discovering everywhere, from more oil, iron ore, bauxite, we're asking the question, will Africans benefit like Australia is benefiting through diversification of the production base?
And do you have an answer yet? Will Africa benefit?
We are not sure. We are not sure. We feel that the voiceless Africans who are not in the room when these deals are made, they are not seeing clearly that there will be real investments in other productive sectors. Second, young Africans worry about their ecological footprint. As consumption patterns in the rest of the world are not changing, people are demanding more from our ecosystems. So the restoration of natural environments after the mining, I think our people are worried. Right now, as we speak, there is overfishing in the Gulf of Guinea. The trawlers are coming from Europe and from Asia, overfishing right now even below the 200-kilometer mile where they should not come.
What's your view, though, in UNIDO? That question I put introducing you, are African nations wise to mortgage their economic well-being to policy decisions and needs in Beijing?
It's not Beijing, it's globally. Africans should be thinking globally. Everybody else is mining in Africa, and we see new waves of others coming. The key for Africa is to focus on diversification. Second, transparency. Can the content of the deals made with whomever, can they be public? Can we also hold those deals to strict sustainability standards? Because, Kevin, I do agree with you, there are global standards on how natural resources should be exploited, but applied in Africa, totally different, irrespective of the source of the company.
Ambassador He, the impression is that China is zeroing in not just on Australia, but almost every other country in the world, which has got resources you can buy up with enormous economic muscle, and this is distorting the resource market.
I think it's a distortion of what we have been doing in Africa. Our cooperation with Africa started very early. To give you a typical example, the railway between Tanzania and Zambia, which we built decades ago. This is a very good example of China's involvement in infrastructure building in Africa. I'll give you an example. Oil export, Africa oil exports to China only constitute 16%, to Europe 36%, to United States 33%. And if talking about investment in oil and gas field in Africa, China's investments only constitute 1/16 of the total investment. And our investment also brought great benefits to African countries. For instance, we have employed, in oil and the gas field, we employed 300,000 people in Africa. We built lots of roads, 218 kilometers of roads, with many 79 schools. I'll give you lots of figures. It's a win-win situation. And also the cooperation is transparent.
There are a lot of nodding heads here. Malini, Mehra.
Firstly, we need to acknowledge the enormously powerful role that China has played in Africa. I mean, China's trade with Africa...
Positive, do you believe?
Positive. I think China's trade with Africa is now the largest trading partner for Africa. It went from something like 10 billion in 2003 to 100 billion just last year. Now, underneath that statistic, however, one sees good and bad. One sees the enormous investment in infrastructure, but one also sees a number of incidents in the extractive sector that cause one concern. allegations of human rights violations. And I think that one has to put it in the context of the resource curse that has afflicted many parts of Africa. If you look, for example, at the grassroots movements now which are emerging, whether you're talking about Sierra Leone or Nigeria, DRC, many parts of Africa which are extremely well endowed in terms of resources, but the people have not benefited. Blood diamonds, oil in Angola, you'll see that actually there are specific solutions which are being pushed, and I would like to ask both Ambassador Hay and Minister Rudd what their views are on this.
Ambassador, you heard there from Malini Mehra. Do you accept those concerns?
Well, these concerns are legitimate, but I think these are not unique to Chinese companies investing in Africa. It's Chinese companies, as I said, it's only constituted a small part of world total investment in Africa. As government, we encourage our companies to be socially responsible, to care for human rights, to donate to local communities, to build schools, etc. I think that they are doing what they can, as other companies are doing in Africa. There are some accidents, and we'll be taking care of that. What I want to emphasize is that we need to encourage all companies in various countries to be responsible stakeholders, to be responsible investors in Africa.
There are specific initiatives, if I may press you on this, tried and tested initiatives such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We heard the gentleman from UNIDO emphasize the importance of transparency. EITI, I think neither of your two countries have signed up to that. The purpose
what is
of
EITI?
that, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It was a multi-stakeholder initiative to ensure that the prices which are paid for concessions, royalties which are paid to countries are put in the public domain, so communities can actually inform themselves and can lay claim to some of the advantages they may not have benefited from.
Kevin Rudd, is this something you should have done in Australia?
We're actually working our way through it right now because we have a vast mining industry which is globally active, and in terms of Africa, I think we have 500 or 600 mining companies active in the continent. So let me tell you, this is right now in the in tray of working it through. And I actually think it's a good initiative. It's also, therefore, necessary to apply globally. The Americans have only recently come on board with this by legislation put forward, I think, by Senator Lugar. This is a good thing. Making sure everyone's adhering to these sorts of standards. Transparency, as our friend from UNIDO said before, is critical in terms of, therefore, the minimisation of corruption as well. Last point, by the way. On the question of giving a proper return to local communities, transparency, that's really important, deals with the corruption issue. One of the reasons we had, I believe, such a large and probably vicious campaign by global mining industries and large Australian mining majors about the increased mining tax in Australia is less to do with us than it is about creating global precedents for all of our friends in Africa and elsewhere.
James Backus, can I come to you, because you're a former US congressman, former special assistant to the trade representative, the US trade representative. When you hear this kind of discussion, how comfortable do you see this as an American?
I have a question for the ambassador from China. Sir, you've been very candid in acknowledging China's hunger for natural resources. Yet there is increasing concern worldwide that China may be hoarding natural resources. More than any other country, China needs to import basic resources in order to continue to grow, and China's certainly doing that. And yet at the same time, perhaps in violation of some WTO rules, China is imposing quotas, taxes, and other forms of export restrictions on raw materials, on rare earth elements, and on other basic resources. How can China expect to continue to import a flood of basic resources from the rest of the world when China imposes exports on its own natural resources?
A lot of people are asking that very same question, Ambassador He.
Two things. One is I want to address this hunger thing, hunger for resources. Again, this is part of globalization. China's need for raw material resources is not just for China. I look at the other side, the product China produces to be consumed everywhere in the world, that contains raw materials. Unfortunately, we have left environmental degradation will pay the price at home. And I'm not talking about it today. Second thing about
our... clear and it is global. The question is about hoarding.
Another thing you have mentioned is our restriction some restriction on rare earths export.
97% of them.
I can tell you the true story is that our deposits of rare earths in China constitute 30% of the world total. But we export or we supply 80 to 90% almost of world need. And this is not really appropriate. We need other countries to join. And for the purpose of protecting environment in China, for the purpose to maintain a steady supply, recently we have exercised some control over the export of rare earths. That is not in contradiction or contravention of WTO rules.
Well, whether in fact China has done that consistently with WTO rules will be the subject perhaps of WTO dispute settlement. But as a matter of public policy, you're right about globalization. In this globalized world, no country can be self-sufficient in everything. So doesn't that imply that no country should try to be restricting exports in anything?
Jim, can I just pick up that point, because it is about an issue of playing by the rules. And I'd like to bring this discussion closer to the end now by talking about what the rules are and the way they have to be, given that we're facing this enormous challenge, crisis, whichever way we want to categorize it. James Cameron.
Yeah, I'd like to grab this because we have made a steadfast effort over many years to build multilateral institutions to deal with many of these issues, particularly climate change, but others as well. And we've had some major disappointments. And yet we know we've got to persevere. Everybody has made it clear. A lot of the comments favor some rational, coherent, multilateral solution to these interdependencies and potential resource conflicts. But we haven't got it. So we can't delay domestic action in hope that the multilateral agreement will give us the answer. That is not an option today. We have to persevere with a hodgepodge, a mishmash, all sorts of unattractive, piecemeal interventions by governments, which we then commit to make coherent as best as we can, partly by staying in the multilateral process, not expecting it to deliver all the results, but staying in the conversation, partly by using regional groups, learning from the WTO where there are plurilateral agreements that work, where there are bilateral agreements that are governed by general principles that free trade and liberalized trade respond to. That is what we're going to be in for some time hence. So we cannot just hand over the responsibility for sorting this out to a multilateral process that's not delivering right now, and yet we can't give up, and we're going to have to build bits and pieces out of what we've got, educate the markets, find some good intellectual breakthroughs on pricing, because we've got still intellectual work to do there, and then offer as many good examples as we can of how it might work for the betterment of humanity to fix these price issues and valuation issues in our economy.
Louise Arbour, how acute is the urgency on this?
We've spent a very interesting debate entirely on the supply side. We haven't even addressed, and we seem to have taken for granted that by 2030 there'll be 8 billion of us, and we haven't spent any time looking at that. But if we had, we would probably have immediately started talking about consumerism and proper consumer habits.
So you're saying consumers have got to change their habits?
No, I think it has nothing to do with consumer. I think the worldwide prohibition or severe restriction on the reproductive freedom of women has an enormous amount to do with population control, and it's completely inexplicable to continue to have barriers preventing women from exercising choice and their reproductive rights. And yet, this would go an enormous distance in having a proper balance between our efforts to control what we see on the supply side and what we are completely oblivious to on the demand side.
But are you underlining what many are saying, that actually it's about reducing consumption or the expectation of consumption of everything that everyone consumes?
Could also be restricting the number of people on Earth, including many that are not there by choice.
Is there an intermediate stage before we get to that? In other words, the immediate challenge?
Well, I think that's pretty immediate in any event. But yes, in addition to that, there's no question that for instance, consumption of meat as opposed to other forms of diet and so on, all this is all very much part, I think, of the consciousness of consumer advocates and climate change advocates. But what we are never willing to discuss, and frankly, I think if the power the actual political power and the means to enforce it was given exclusively to women. And women don't all agree on these issues. But if collectively women could have control of their reproductive freedom, I think this entire equation of supply and demand might look somewhat different.
In that case, I turn
years.
immediately to Malini.
Well, let me say, for the sake of brevity, I concur entirely with Louise in terms of the importance of educating women and providing them with reproductive choices. I want to come to the issue, however, which is going to continue to be on the table, and that's about our unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. That's not going to go away, regardless of whether it's 8 billion people by 2030 or 5 billion people if we have mega death as a result of climate really gripping. The point I want to make is this. All countries are challenged by this unsustainability in terms of their economic systems. We must not use this as an opportunity to demonize countries such as China. I think that's entirely counterproductive. We have to look at the emergence of good practice wherever we see it, and there's a lot of good practice. We haven't spent enough time on business because most business leaders, whether it's at the World Economic Forum or in company boardrooms, are discussing the issue of resource scarcity because they cannot deal with the volatility of commodity prices. They're looking ahead 30, 50 years, they're looking at new systems, they're looking at closed loop systems, massive investments in resource efficiency. So actually they can continue to be in business when we have emergent middle class, which is something like 70 million people every year.
Let me bring this discussion to an end by asking the diplomat and the politician. Do you believe the political class, of which you are one, can somehow change consumption patterns if there's greater scarcity of resources growing at this kind of rate we've been discussing?
Let me throw the curveball right back at you, Nick Gowing. And it is
I'm not a politician. I don't run a country.
Here we go. Let me tell you, this program, which goes out to 60 or 70 million people across the world, is just as important as what we in the political class make a decision on. You know why? Because in so many of our countries, we are dealing with communities who will have a view about whether the prices for their living standards should go up and up and up. If they are made to understand or allowed to understand what actual collective benefit is given to us all by that occurring, by sticking a price on carbon or freeing up properly agricultural markets, then it works. So you ask how the political will can be formed. Well, it's easy to say politicians have courage. That's terrific. I've seen many of them have it. I've seen some who haven't. But in shaping the political environment, you guys in the Fourth Estate have as much responsibility as anybody else.
Well, my challenge to you Kevin Rudd, that's why we are doing this program, to exactly put it on the agenda. But if I was to give you, if I was to give you unscripted 20 seconds to look at that camera and give a message to people about consumption, what would you as a politician say? I don't run a country, you have just been running a country, and you are still involved in overseeing part of the policy of one country. What would you be saying to consumers out there about the scarcity and the dangers ahead? 20 seconds, unscripted.
When you have a glass of water, think about how dry our continent Australia is. We're the driest continent on Earth. Think carefully about the purposes to which you put that glass of water, or when you have a shower. Secondly, when you turn the light on, think about whether in fact you need to have that light on, because guess what? It's fueled by coal-fired power stations, and that contributes to your kids' ability to survive tomorrow with global warming. These two things should affect your behaviour and what you do every day.
Kevin Rudd, unscripted, unprepared, without any notice. Thank you. I'm tempted to ask Ambassador He, would you like the same 20 seconds to tell us what you would tell the Chinese people, in English, of course. But based on the 5-year plan and the urgency and the greater efficiency which is now embedded in the language of the last few weeks, because otherwise you're going to be facing this acute natural resource scarcity in your country.
I think I've answered that question before. I would rather make 3 appeals on macro level, if I may. One is let's work together for a green economy where people have to change their way of life, especially in advanced countries. Secondly, again, we need to work together to stabilize the prices of commodities, big ticket commodities. No huge fluctuations. And lastly, but not the least, we need to pay more attention, much more attention, to bridge the gap between rich and poor. Especially, we need to bring up the capacity to sustain its economy in least developing countries. This developmental gap need to be filled as soon as we can.
I'm tempted, in the interest of balance, to give you each 20 seconds or the opportunity. What would you say needs to be done? Malini, Mehra, what has to be done on consumption?
We are all complicit with creating unsustainability, and we all have to be part of the solution to addressing it. So look at our own patterns as consumers, as investors, and as citizens, and let's vote in people who say the right thing and follow it with action.
James Cameron?
Get informed, get learning about the interactions between energy, water, food security, in whatever way is accessible to you, in languages that make sense to you. 2, get involved. Be a part of the political process, be a part of a community response, do something in your family, find some way of owning the solutions and feeling confident about them.
And realizing the acuteness of it.
Yeah, and 3, get investing. See opportunity in the transformation that we must make. Don't make this a wholly pessimistic story. Find a way of channeling capital into solutions that are attractive for development purposes because they make better use of resources.
And Louise Arbour?
I think it comes down to courage, I think, in the case of politicians. I would certainly tell the electorate not to hold their politicians hostages to a very short-term agenda that caters only to their very immediate self-interest, and to think globally, act locally, and in a democratic system, encourage your politicians to act in a manner that is responsible for the broader public interest.
Thank you to you all. We've ended on a vivid, robust note here. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to our panel and delegates here at this World Economic Forum meeting in Dubai. I think it's clear the pressure on natural resources will only get greater. We've highlighted in this BBC World Debate the massive challenges and the dilemmas that simply will not go away. And at the end, you've heard the messages from me, Nick Gowing. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.